John had always dreamed of living in a peaceful, suburban neighborhood. The kind of place where kids rode their bikes in cul-de-sacs and neighbors waved at each other while watering their lawns. So when he finally moved into his new home in the outskirts of Denver, Colorado, he thought he'd hit the jackpot. It was a charming two-story house with a white picket fence and a driveway that could fit 2 cars comfortably. But little did he know, his dreams of tranquility were about to be bulldozed, literally and figuratively, by Karen, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the neighbor, the kind who made HOA guidelines her personal Bible and wielded them like a medieval knight swinging a broadsword. Except there wasn't an actual HOA in this neighborhood. Not officially. Karen had simply decided there should be one and took it upon herself to enforce rules that didn't exist. She was like a vigilante, but instead of fighting crime, she fought flower beds that weren't symmetrical and mailboxes that didn't match the color scheme she'd arbitrarily chosen. John's first encounter with Karen happened on moving day. As he unloaded boxes from the U-Haul, Karen appeared out of nowhere, like a hawk spotting prey, and marched straight up to him. She wore oversized sunglasses, a visor that screamed, "I'm here to micromanage," and carried a clipboard. A clipboard? Who carries a clipboard to introduce themselves? "Hi, I'm Karen," she said briskly, not bothering with pleasantries like, "Welcome to the neighborhood" or "Need help lifting that couch?" Instead, she launched into an unsolicited lecture about how John's trash bins needed to be stored out of sight at all times because visible bins lower property values. John nodded politely, thinking this was just her way of being helpful. Oh, how wrong he was. The real trouble began a week later when John noticed Karen's car, a shiny silver SUV, parked smack in the middle of his driveway. At first, he thought it might be a mistake. Maybe she'd parked there temporarily while visiting another neighbor, but hours passed, and the car remained. By evening, John knocked on Karen's door to address the issue. "Oh, that's just my car," Karen said casually, as though parking in someone else's driveway was the most normal thing in the world. "I've always used that space. The previous owners didn't mind." "Well," John replied as calmly as he could muster, "I mind." Karen frowned as if John had committed some unspeakable sin by asserting ownership over his own property. "You know," she said with an air of condescension, "technically speaking, driveways are part of the community space." John blinked. Community space? He had read every word of his property deed before buying the house. It was practically tattooed on his brain, and nowhere did it say anything about his driveway being communal. "I don't think that's accurate," John said diplomatically, "but I'd appreciate it if you could move your car." Karen sighed dramatically but agreed to move it, eventually. The next morning, however, her SUV was back in its usual spot on John's driveway, like an unwanted guest who refuses to leave after Thanksgiving dinner. This pattern continued for days. John would ask Karen to move her car. Karen would begrudgingly comply only to park it there again hours later. It was like playing whack-a-mole with entitlement. Finally fed up, John decided to escalate matters by calling the police. Not because he wanted to involve law enforcement, but because he genuinely didn't know what else to do. When the officers arrived and asked Karen about her parking habits, she doubled down on her absurd claim that John's driveway was community property. She even produced a stack of printed-out HOA guidelines, which were clearly fake because there wasn't an HOA in this neighborhood, to bolster her argument. "This is harassment," Karen screeched when the officers sided with John and told her she couldn't park there anymore. "Actually," one officer said dryly while pointing at John's deed paperwork, "this is his driveway." Karen stormed back into her house, muttering threats about filing complaints and organizing petitions to reclaim community spaces. For a brief moment after that incident, things seemed to settle down. Karen stopped parking in John's driveway, or so he thought. One afternoon while returning from work, John found not one but 2 cars parked on his property. Karen's SUV and her adult son's sedan. "Oh," Karen said nonchalantly when confronted yet again. "My son needed somewhere to park while visiting me." "Your son can park on your driveway," John snapped. Karen shrugged as though this suggestion was utterly preposterous and went back inside without another word. At this point, John realized he wasn't dealing with an ordinary neighborly dispute. He was facing a full-blown turf war against someone who believed rules didn't apply to her unless she made them herself. He tried reasoning with her one last time by showing her legal documents proving his ownership of the driveway, but Karen dismissed them as irrelevant. "You're being selfish," she declared indignantly before slamming her door shut. Selfish? Selfish. John couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could wanting access to your own driveway be considered selfish? It was like calling someone greedy for eating their own sandwich instead of sharing it with strangers. As days turned into weeks and Karen continued parking wherever she pleased despite repeated warnings from both John and local authorities, something inside him snapped. Not in an angry or violent way, but in a creative way fueled by spiteful determination. If Karen wanted war over his driveway so badly, well then, war she would get. Karen's crusade against John's driveway wasn't just a nuisance. It was starting to feel like a full-blown campaign. If Karen had a slogan, it would have been something like, "Driveways for all," or "Community over property rights." She was relentless, and John quickly learned that reasoning with her was about as effective as negotiating with a raccoon over your trash cans. One morning, John woke up to find Karen standing in his driveway with a group of neighbors. She had organized what could only be described as a protest, complete with homemade signs that read things like, "Driveways belong to the people," and "Stop hoarding space." The irony was not lost on John, considering Karen's car had been hoarding his driveway for weeks. "Karen," John said, stepping outside in his pajamas. "What is this?" "It's a peaceful demonstration," Karen replied, her tone dripping with self-righteousness. "We're here to reclaim community spaces." "Community spaces? This is my private property." Karen smirked. "That's debatable." John stared at her in disbelief. "It's not debatable. I have the deed." Karen waved her clipboard dramatically. "I have the guidelines." John didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The guidelines she referred to were clearly something she'd cobbled together herself, probably during one of her late-night Pinterest sessions. They weren't legally binding, but Karen wielded them like they were the Constitution. The protest lasted all morning. Karen handed out flyers to passersby, explaining her vision for the neighborhood. Shared driveways, communal trash bins, and mandatory lawn gnomes, because apparently, gnomes were essential for fostering community spirit. Most neighbors took the flyers politely before tossing them into their recycling bins. A few even apologized to John and whispered things like, "She's crazy. Don't mind her." But Karen wasn't deterred by the lack of enthusiasm. She doubled down on her efforts by filing an official complaint with the city council. When John received notice of the complaint in the mail, he couldn't believe his eyes. The document accused him of selfishly monopolizing driveway space and demanded that his property be rezoned as a shared-use area. John immediately contacted his lawyer, who assured him that Karen's complaint was baseless. Still, it was infuriating that she'd gone this far. It wasn't just about the driveway anymore, it was about principle. The city council scheduled a hearing to address Karen's complaint. On the day of the hearing, Karen arrived dressed like she was auditioning for a courtroom drama. Blazer, pearls, and an air of smug confidence that could suffocate a room. She carried a binder labeled Exhibit A Driveway Injustice, which she slammed onto the table with theatrical flair. John sat across from her with his lawyer and a stack of documents proving his ownership of the driveway. He didn't bother with theatrics. He let the facts speak for themselves. Karen presented her case first. She argued that shared driveways would promote harmony among neighbors and cited several obscure articles she'd found online about communal living spaces in Scandinavian countries. She even brought in a slideshow featuring stock photos of smiling families sharing driveways, none of whom looked remotely American. When it was John's turn to speak, he kept it simple. "This is my driveway. I own it outright. Here's the deed." The council members glanced at Karen's binder and then at John's deed before exchanging knowing looks. It was clear whose argument held water. Karen tried to salvage her case by accusing John of being anti-community. She claimed he had refused to participate in neighborhood events and once ignored an invitation to her book club, which was true. John had no interest in discussing Eat, Pray, Love over lukewarm tea. But these accusations only made her look petty. In the end, the council dismissed Karen's complaint entirely. John thought this would be the end of it, that Karen would finally accept defeat and move on. But he underestimated her tenacity. A week later, Karen escalated her tactics by parking not just her car but also her husband's truck and their teenage son's motorcycle in John's driveway. It was like she'd declared war and sent in reinforcements. John confronted her again, but Karen refused to budge, literally or figuratively. "If you want your driveway back," she said smugly, "you'll have to take it up with my lawyer." John couldn't believe it. Her lawyer? What kind of person hires legal representation over a driveway dispute? But sure enough, Karen had retained an attorney, a man named Barry who looked like he spent more time golfing than practicing law. Barry sent John a letter claiming that Karen had established adverse possession over part of his driveway because she'd been using it continuously without permission for several weeks. The argument was laughable. Adverse possession takes years to establish, not weeks, and requires proof of exclusive use and maintenance. John showed Barry's letter to his own lawyer, who chuckled before drafting a response that dismantled every point Barry had made. He also advised John to install security cameras to document any further trespassing. Karen wasn't happy about the cameras. She accused John of violating her privacy and demanded he take them down immediately. When he refused, she retaliated by hosting another protest, this time with balloons and snacks, as if turning his driveway into Party Central would somehow strengthen her case. At this point, other neighbors began distancing themselves from Karen entirely. Her antics were drawing unwanted attention to the neighborhood and making everyone uncomfortable. One neighbor even left an anonymous note on John's doorstep that read, "Thank you for standing up to her." Despite mounting pressure from both neighbors and legal authorities, Karen refused to back down. She started parking on John's lawn when his driveway was full, an act so brazen it bordered on comedy. John decided enough was enough. If Karen wanted chaos, he'd give it to her, but on his terms. And so began his plan for ultimate revenge. John had reached the point where dealing with Karen felt less like a neighborly dispute and more like starring in a low-budget soap opera titled Driveways of Our Lives. Every time he thought the drama was over, Karen found a way to escalate it, like a villain who simply refused to stay dead. But this time, John wasn't going to play defense anymore. No, he was done being the reasonable guy. It was time to go on the offensive. Karen wanted chaos? Fine. John would give her chaos, but he'd do it legally, creatively, and with just the right amount of spite. The first step in John's master plan was research. He dove into local zoning laws, property rights regulations, and obscure municipal codes like a man possessed. He learned more about driveway easements than any sane person should ever know. He even consulted his lawyer, who at this point was fully invested in the absurdity of the situation and offered advice with an amused grin. After weeks of preparation, John unveiled his piece de resistance. He was going to make his driveway unusable for Karen and anyone else, while ensuring it remained perfectly functional for himself. The solution? A moat. Yes, a literal moat. John hired a construction crew and explained his plan in detail. The workers were skeptical at first. "You want us to dig a trench around your driveway?" But when John showed them the permits he'd secured from the city, because yes, this was entirely legal, they shrugged and got to work. The trench wasn't just any trench. It was a marvel of petty engineering. It ran along both sides of the driveway and was deep enough to deter even the most determined trespasser. To add an extra layer of absurdity, John decided to install a drawbridge at the entrance of the driveway, a fully functional, medieval-style drawbridge that could be raised and lowered with the push of a button. When Karen saw the construction crew digging up John's property, she stormed over in her usual fashion. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on her nose like she was about to audit their taxes. "What is this?" she demanded, gesturing wildly at the trench. "It's my driveway improvement project," John replied cheerfully. "You can't do this," Karen screeched. "This is against community standards." John raised an eyebrow. "What community standards? There's no HOA here." Karen sputtered incoherently for a moment before switching tactics. "You're ruining the aesthetic of the neighborhood." John gestured toward her SUV, which was currently parked halfway on his lawn. "I think we passed aesthetic a long time ago." Karen tried calling the city to complain about the construction. But since John had all the necessary permits, her efforts went nowhere. She even attempted to rally other neighbors against him. But by now most of them were so fed up with her antics that they either ignored her or actively supported John's project out of sheer schadenfreude. When the trench was complete and the drawbridge installed, John threw a small grand opening party for his driveway. He invited only his closest friends and a few sympathetic neighbors, the kind who'd been quietly cheering him on from their porches. They drank lemonade and took turns raising and lowering the drawbridge like kids playing with a new toy. Karen watched from her window with an expression that could curdle milk. The next morning, Karen tried parking her SUV on John's driveway again, only to discover that she couldn't get past the raised drawbridge. She stood there for several minutes, staring at it as though sheer willpower might lower it. When that didn't work, she marched up to John's front door and pounded on it furiously. "What is wrong with you?" she demanded when John opened the door. "Nothing," he replied innocently. "I just wanted some privacy." "This is insane," Karen shouted. "You can't seriously expect me to park somewhere else." "Actually," John said with mock seriousness, "I think that's exactly what I expect." Karen stormed off in a huff but didn't give up easily. Over the next few days, she tried everything from climbing over the trench, unsuccessfully, to throwing small objects at John's security cameras in an attempt to disable them, also unsuccessfully. At one point, she even attempted to bribe one of his friends into giving her access to the drawbridge controls, a move so desperate it bordered on comedy. But John had anticipated every possible counterattack and made sure his Moat and drawbridge system was foolproof. The controls were password protected, and he'd installed additional security measures just in case Karen tried anything truly reckless. And reckless she did try. One night, under cover of darkness, Karen snuck onto John's property armed with gardening tools and what appeared to be sheer determination fueled by caffeine and rage. Her plan? To fill in part of the trench herself so she could drive across it. Unfortunately for Karen, but fortunately for everyone else, John's security cameras caught every moment of her ill-fated excavation attempt. The footage showed her struggling with a shovel while muttering curses under her breath, and then accidentally falling into the very trench she was trying to fill. John couldn't help but laugh when he reviewed the footage later. It was like watching an episode of America's Funniest Home Videos, except instead of someone slipping on ice or getting hit by a piñata stick, it was Karen waging war against dirt and losing spectacularly. The next day, John handed over the footage to local authorities. Karen was charged with trespassing and vandalism, not exactly felonies but enough to land her in hot water legally. She also had to pay fines for attempting unauthorized alterations to someone else's property. By now, Karen's reputation in the neighborhood had taken such a nosedive that even her staunchest allies, if you could call them that, started distancing themselves from her. Her protests dwindled. Her clipboard disappeared. And for once in her life, Karen seemed genuinely defeated. As for John, he finally got what he wanted: peace and quiet, and exclusive access to his own driveway without interference from rogue SUVs or fake HOA guidelines. And every time he lowered that drawbridge with its satisfying mechanical whirring sound, he couldn't help but smile at how far he'd gone just to prove one simple point. Don't mess with someone who knows how to weaponize spite legally. Karen's fall from grace was nothing short of spectacular. Once the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, she now found herself dethroned, disgraced, and, most importantly, drivewayless. Her SUV sat forlornly in her own driveway, a driveway she had long neglected in favor of John's, and her clipboard had been relegated to gathering dust in a corner of her garage. For the first time in years, Karen was silent. But silence, as John soon discovered, didn't mean surrender. Karen's legal troubles had been a blow to her ego, but if there was one thing Karen excelled at, it was denial. She refused to acknowledge that she'd lost the battle or the war, and instead began spinning a narrative that painted her as the victim of a cruel and unjust system. According to Karen, John wasn't just a neighbor. He was a tyrant who had weaponized bureaucracy to oppress her and the community. "She's telling people I'm some kind of driveway dictator," John said one afternoon to his lawyer, who was now more of a friend than a legal advisor. A driveway dictator. Can you believe that? The lawyer chuckled. Well, you did build a moat. Fair point. Karen's victim narrative gained little traction among the neighbors, most of whom were relieved to see her finally face consequences for her actions. But Karen wasn't one to let facts get in the way of her story. She started hosting community meetings in her backyard, meetings that were essentially just thinly veiled smear campaigns against John. She's calling me Moat Man, John said to his friend Dave during one such meeting, which he could hear faintly from his kitchen window. Like it's some kind of insult. Dave laughed. Honestly, that sounds kind of cool. John had to admit it did have a certain ring to it. Despite Karen's best efforts, her meetings were sparsely attended. Most neighbors had grown tired of her antics and were more interested in enjoying their newfound peace than participating in yet another drama. Even Karen's husband seemed less invested. He spent most of his time tinkering with his truck or pretending not to hear her rants. But Karen wasn't ready to give up entirely. If she couldn't rally the neighborhood against John, she'd try a different approach. Bureaucracy. She began filing complaints with every city department she could think of. Zoning, sanitation, even animal control. Despite the fact that John didn't own any pets, each complaint was more ridiculous than the last. One day, John received a notice from the city claiming that his drawbridge might be a potential hazard to wildlife. Wildlife. The only wildlife in the area were squirrels and pigeons, neither of which seemed remotely interested in his driveway. I think she's just throwing darts at a list of departments, John said to his lawyer when he called for advice. Let her, the lawyer replied. She's wasting their time, not yours. Sure enough, every complaint Karen filed was dismissed almost as quickly as it was submitted. The city officials were polite but firm. John's moat and drawbridge were entirely legal and posed no threat to anyone, wildlife included. Frustrated by her lack of progress, Karen decided to take matters into her own hands. Again. This time, however, she didn't resort to trespassing or vandalism. She resorted to pettiness on an Olympic level. One morning, John woke up to find that Karen had installed an enormous inflatable unicorn on her front lawn directly across from his house. The unicorn was bright pink with glittery wings and stood at least 10 feet tall. It wasn't just an eyesore. It was positioned perfectly so that its head blocked part of John's view out his living room window. What is that? Dave asked when he came over later that day. Karen's latest masterpiece, John replied dryly. She really hates you. I think it's mutual at this point. The unicorn wasn't just decorative. It was symbolic. Karen had attached a sign around its neck that read, "Beware of tyrants." It didn't mention John by name, but everyone knew who it was aimed at. John considered retaliating, maybe with an inflatable dragon or a giant banner that said, "Keep out," but ultimately decided against it. He didn't want to stoop to Karen's level. Besides, he figured the unicorn would deflate eventually, either literally or metaphorically. Sure enough, after about 2 weeks, the unicorn disappeared, likely due to complaints from other neighbors who were tired of its garish presence. But Karen wasn't done being petty. She simply shifted tactics. She started leaving passive-aggressive notes in everyone's mailboxes about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of standing up for community values. Most neighbors tossed them into the trash without reading them fully. One neighbor even returned hers with "Please stop" scrawled across it in red marker. Through all this chaos, John remained remarkably calm. He'd learned early on that engaging with Karen only fueled her behavior. Ignoring her seemed far more effective. Besides, he had other things to focus on, like finally enjoying his driveway without interference. One evening as he sat on his porch sipping iced tea and watching the sunset over his moat, a sentence he never thought he'd say, John felt something he hadn't felt in months. Peace. The trench gleamed in the fading light. The drawbridge stood proudly like a monument to petty revenge. And for once, there was no sign of Karen anywhere. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about reclaiming his space and his sanity. And as far as John was concerned, both were firmly back where they belonged, on his side of the drawbridge. John had finally achieved peace, or at least as much peace as one could expect when living across the street from Karen. The Moat and Drawbridge had become neighborhood legends, earning him a reputation as the guy who did what we all wish we could do. He was hailed as a hero by some, a madman by others, and a tyrant exclusively by Karen. But John didn't care. For the first time in months, his driveway was his own, and Karen's reign of terror had been reduced to passive-aggressive notes and occasional lawn decorations. But just when John thought life had returned to normal, something unexpected happened. Karen apologized. It was a sunny Saturday morning when Karen knocked on John's door. He opened it cautiously, half expecting her to be holding another clipboard or perhaps a flaming bag of dog poop. Instead, she stood there empty-handed, looking uncharacteristically sheepish. "John," she began, her voice lacking its usual edge. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." John blinked. Was this a trick? A setup for some elaborate scheme? He glanced around to see if there were hidden cameras or a mob of neighbors waiting to ambush him. "For what?" he asked warily. "For everything," Karen replied. "The driveway, the protests, the unicorn, all of it." John narrowed his eyes. "Even the fake HOA guidelines?" Karen winced. "Yes, even those." She explained that her behavior stemmed from a deep-seated need for control, something she'd struggled with for years. She admitted that she'd let her ego get the best of her and that she regretted how far things had gone. "I know I've been difficult," she said, which was putting it mildly, "but I want to make things right." John didn't know what to say. On one hand, he appreciated the gesture. On the other hand, this was Karen. Could he really trust her? "I'll think about it," he said finally. Karen nodded and left without further argument, a rarity in itself. Over the next few weeks, Karen made an effort to prove she was serious about changing. She stopped filing complaints against John and even removed the inflatable unicorn from her garage, though John suspected it had been punctured during one of her husband's truck repairs. She started waving at him when they passed each other on the street, a small but significant gesture, and even invited him to one of her infamous backyard meetings. John declined the invitation but appreciated the effort. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood began to settle down. The Moat became less of a spectacle and more of a quirky landmark. Kids rode their bikes around it like it was part of an obstacle course, and neighbors occasionally joked about installing their own drawbridges. Even Karen's husband seemed happier now that his wife wasn't waging war against their entire block. One day, John received an anonymous note in his mailbox. It wasn't passive-aggressive or accusatory. Instead, it was a simple thank you letter. "Dear Moat Man, thank you for standing up to Karen. You've inspired us all to set boundaries, literally and figuratively, and we're grateful for your courage and creativity. Keep being awesome. Sincerely, a grateful neighbor." John couldn't help but smile. He didn't know who had written the note. Maybe Dave or one of the other neighbors. But it felt good to know that his ridiculous revenge plot had actually made a difference. As for Karen, she continued her journey toward redemption. She joined a local book club, one that didn't involve eat, pray, love, and started volunteering at a community garden. She even planted flowers along her driveway, a symbolic gesture that made John laugh every time he saw them. By the end of the summer, things were almost back to normal, or as normal as they could be in a neighborhood where moats were considered acceptable landscaping choices. John still kept his drawbridge up most of the time, just in case, but he no longer felt like he was living under siege. And while he'd never admit it out loud, part of him almost missed the chaos. Almost. So what's the moral of this story? Is it about standing up for yourself? The importance of setting boundaries? Or maybe just how far you can go with petty revenge if you have enough creativity and legal permits? Honestly, it's probably all of the above, and maybe a little bit about how inflatable unicorns should stay in theme parks where they belong. At the end of the day, John learned that sometimes peace isn't something you find. It's something you build, preferably with a moat and a drawbridge. Thanks for sticking around for this wild ride. If you enjoyed this story, or if you're now considering installing your own moat, don't forget to like, share, comment below with your thoughts, or your own crazy neighbor stories, and subscribe for more tales like this one. See you next time.